All right, I just put the recording on. We'll sort of start from this place. I know I'm about a minute early, and it seems to me to be a little consequence considering how wordy I am. You can come in almost any place and get all the important content. We're going to talk about two more post-impressionists today, Gauguin and Van Gogh, who are linked in history in that at a crucial time in the career of both men, they were roommates in Arles in the south of France. My pronunciation is probably inaccurate. Arles is A-R-L-E-S. Van Gogh lived in Arles and invited a painter that he knew only a little of and had met only a couple of times prior to this, but they got together and shared a house in 1889 at the end of the year. I believe that roommate situation was from about September to December. A way they got together was that in those days, artists in Paris would exchange work with one another. They would trade paintings that they had done and trade materials that one or the other had access to. And this was the way a lot of relationships were started and furthered. Gauguin and the painter Bernard, B-E-R-N-A-R-D, and Van Gogh exchanged paintings. The original mutual interest they had was in Japanese prints. I mentioned those before and how important they were to the post-impressionists and the impressionists before them, in that they had a use of flat perspective, bold colors in Japanese prints. The other thing was that they had been previously unseen in the West before popular printing presses made those materials available to everyone. So one thing these painters did, was exchanged prints. I have my slides numbered here, and I don't want to get confused. So the particular works that they exchanged are in my materials, but I'm not sure if they're numbered in such a way that they'll come up just now. And then, so let me talk about Gauguin first. My model for this course is to discuss post-impressionism in terms of postmodernism, which is a modern philosophy that says there's no ultimate style that ought to be seen as the end of history as far as painting goes. That styles and movements come from the people that you're surrounded by and the environment that you live in, and people are part of that environment. The Impressionists had a manifesto that involved light, and then when we switched to the Post-Impressionists, they expanded that. They still painted in much the same way as the Impressionists, but they weren't concerned with natural effects. They weren't concerned with seeing nature. I'm going to put this in quotes. I don't use air quotes, but I'm nevertheless going to tell you this is in quotes. They painted nature as it is seen. The Post-Impressionists aren't so concerned as that. They stylized nature. They saw it as they intuited it. In other words, they used their own personal feeling for what they were looking at. And that personal feeling comes across in the picture a lot more than recording in the manner of a realist like Pissarro and Renoir. to call them realists is stretching it as far as I'm concerned. But they were definitely trying to record things as they saw them, incorporating light effects that are transitory and that change over time. Now, to begin with, Gauguin, we're definitely going to see as we go through a lot of his works in the next hour, how he was interested in dismissing all of the conventions, social conventions and painting conventions, and get right down to his personal view of things, his personal way of seeing things. And to characterize Gauguin quickly, everyone who knew him, and historically, he's known for his arrogance. He's known for being callous, self-centered, and
it's like a certain president.
Well, I didn't say that, but I'm glad you did. And let me give you the primary example of this from my point of view. As an artist who struggled outside of anything anybody could call success in my own career, I've nevertheless had to be responsible to other people, you know? And one thing I decided early on was that if I was going to pursue the life of an artist, I wasn't going to have my own dependents. So I never raised children of my own, though I married a woman who had 3 children, and we get along quite nicely, and we have a family unit. But, you know, even though I'm an artist, it's always seemed to me incumbent upon human beings to accept their responsibilities. And there's something secondary about an art career, to me, to what a person owes to the folks around them. And that dependency is a very real situation. You know, if there's anything good that's coming out of the crisis we're in now, is that people are going to realize they're dependent on other people, you know, even dependent, heaven forbid, on our government, which is an expression of community, our reliance on one another. Now, having said all that, Gauguin rejected it. And the primary evidence I have personally to say that he was an arrogant and self-centered person is that in order to pursue his art, he dismissed all of his personal connections. And in his case, that means he was dismissing a family, a wife and 5 children, 5, count them, 5 children. He abandoned this lovely woman, Mette Gauguin, in an evening dress. This is a portrait by Gauguin from 1884. He abandoned his wife and kids and abandoned his career as a stockbroker because it was the desire of his to return to a primitive state, an uncultivated state of man, because he wanted to pursue man in its primitive state, man before the requirements of society, and you might even say, and let's go ahead and say it, the personal responsibilities of an adult person to other people. He dismissed that as being an unnecessary convention. Now, I want to say as we go through these ideas that that very idea is itself a convention. The idea of primitive man, we have no idea what primitive man was like. But there was a philosopher, I'm sure you've heard of, Henri Rousseau, who's very influential on French thinkers, French society, and also on the French Revolution. And he formulated the idea in a national essay contest in France of this man in his primitive state, apart from the conventions of society. Now, there's a convention about that too. because we have no idea what man in his primitive state is. Now, if you've lived in West Virginia for a year, as I did, without plumbing, without heat, except for an old Franklin-style stove and wood that I chopped myself, now that's a primitive state. And Gauguin was going to run into that head on, and perhaps he would have dismissed the idea of there being something idyllic about having no societal connections and throwing off the trappings of modern life. He was going to learn the hard way what the reality is of a primitive life without conventions, without connection to other people. He was going to learn that time and time again. I don't think the lesson ever sunk in. He went to his grave in Tahiti, by the way, and we'll get to that, still believing that in his ideal state of pagan worship and a natural connection to the forests, to nature, that man was somehow improved, and that all the overlay of conventional society was an unnecessary encumbrance on human beings, especially on a painter. Now, what we're seeing up here comes from a trip that Gauguin made to the island of Martinique in 1887. And he was fascinated by that. He had traveled with another artist on this fairly brief trip, but his idea was to get back to a state of nature, and he sought that on the island of Martinique. What he didn't seek on the island of Martinique was a wicked case of dysentery, which he acquired, and which caused him no end of difficulty. This is a coastal landscape from Martinique that he painted. You can see that he's painting in the Impressionist style, in that he's recording elements of life, of light. There's no artificial perspective in this picture, like the Japanese prints that were a model for him. He painted on the flat, so that what we see here is a pattern of images, and light and shadow, although they exist here, are not intended to create any distinction between the mountain ranges far in the background and this goat in the tree here in the foreground. All of those are elements of Impressionist painting. And this is a coastal landscape from Martinique. As I said, it was a critical state of nature that Gauguin was attempting to capture. Moving on to my next slide here. These are mango trees, also painting from 1887 on his experience in Martinique. So we see what he determined to be native women living close to the ground, apart from the trappings of conventional society. And this is something that Gauguin sought for himself. Now, as I said, he abandoned his wife and kids and gave them no means of support. He barely supported himself for his entire art career. He started late in his 30s. I don't have the exact date for you, but I know that it's true that by the time he was 40 years old as a painter, unlike other painters, he had yet to discover his mature style. This is still more closely related to Impressionism than to Post-Impressionism, where he has yet to dispense with what he sees and go into a fanciful, even surrealistic and spiritualistic point of view that is a feature of his later work. Let's see. Do we get to next? Here is a early portrait of Gauguin from 1886, a self-portrait. Does he look like Anthony Quinn?
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Anthony Quinn played Gauguin in the movie Lust for Life, where Kirk Douglas played Van Gogh. And that movie, I believe it's a John Huston film. I'm not absolutely certain who the director of Lust for Life was. But if you recall that film, it very much romanticizes the idea of the independent artist living barely above the poverty level and seeking his own vision with an absolute disregard for the consequences. You know, his artistic life prevailed. That was what he was seeking, and he dismissed everything else as an unnecessary encumbrance. You can see the character of the man. I think it's a pretty good self-portrait in that it does communicate something of his personality. If I was an actor and I wanted to indicate to you that I was a thoughtful person, a person of mental qualities that predominated over physical qualities, I might scratch my chin. I know my dad, who was a good amateur actor, would have put his hand on his chin like that to indicate that he was a thinking man, not someone more in the physical realm. And we're definitely going to see that Gauguin fits that characterization. And the point I was making is that this idea of the rough, primitive life of a visionary artist seeking only to fulfill his art is very much part of Van Gogh and Gauguin, as they're characterized in the movie Lust for Life, where you see Anthony Quinn as Gauguin and Kirk Douglas as Van Gogh, chewing up the scenery, basically. After Martinique, Gauguin went to Brittany in the north of France, which was another area where he felt people were living a spiritual life closer to nature. And in Brittany, people took the worship of God very seriously, and it was a Catholic parish that he lived in. This is a picture called A Vision After the Sermon, Jacob Wrestling with the Angel. And here we see a marked departure from Impressionism in that the only person I've ever heard of who credibly claimed to have seen angels was William Blake. And one explanation for that is that he didn't eat very well, and perhaps he was in some sort of feverish state. But Gauguin frequently puts religious symbols into his work and associated his own life with that sort of saintliness, that sort of religious vision. And he also did treatments of the church in the local community where he lived in Brittany, and he idolized the environment as being much closer to the spiritual life that he was pursuing than the life of Paris, which basically disgusted him, along with the conventional attachments that he gave up in order to pursue his life as an artist. So here he is approaching his 40th birthday and still working out what was going to be his trademark style, which, as a post-impressionist, to be in that category involved really the first sort of surreal painting in the modern art catalog, where he's dispensing with what can be seen and reworking reality to conform with an inner vision. That's going to be characteristic of all his work. So as I'm saying, this idea of the primitive is in itself a convention. It's a romantic view of primitive life without modern conveniences and the encumbrances of our connections to other people, even. And it's romanticized in that it dispenses with how difficult it is to live, without plumbing or heat. Nevertheless, that's what Gauguin is pursuing, and that's what he admires, a spiritual view of the world that predominates over the world as it is. He did some pictures. I don't have a slide to show you. He did some pictures of the local church and attempted to sell them to the parish priest, but his work was rejected as not being suitable for the church. And then I'm going to pull up another series of slides to pull from.
Drew,
Yes,
I have
go
a
ahead.
question for you. How did he reconcile his rejection of family values with this concern with the spiritual life? Or was he trying to live more like a nun and
definitely had
in that way?
He definitely had more affinity for a life dedicated totally to the spirit. Now, it's hard to imagine that he was in any way a conventional Catholic either. I mean, he certainly wasn't. I mean, he wasn't a regular churchgoer. And we're going to see, when he lived with Van Gogh, part of the weekly budgeting of their resources involved money for what they called hygienic purposes, which meant taking a trip to the local brothel. Van Gogh and Gauguin both contracted syphilis in their adulthood. So to say that he was a moral man, a Catholic man, seems to me to be inaccurate. But he nevertheless associated clearly with the idea of a spiritual life, although he dispensed with the Catholic Church as being a conventional sort of spirituality, and saw himself, his own personal vision, as being more important than the trappings of the church. This is a Breton woman. I believe this is the usual headdress of a Breton woman, but she does have the appearance of a nun here, at least as far as I remember. Sally Field in The Flying Nun. Tell me if you've heard this. But he's making it up as he goes along, because that's the hubris of the man. That's the arrogance of the man. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think it's something that we have to see in his work. This is another Breton subject, women standing together. They're beautiful paintings. I'm not trying to detract from them in any way. I think I like Gauguin's work. I just don't like him as a guy, and I think it is the height of arrogance to not have any sort of critical sense of your own thought processes and your own way of life. So there's the Breton subject. Let's see what else is on the slab here. as they would say. Okay, so here's another religiously themed painting. This is Jeanne d'Arc, or A Breton Girl Spinning, where he is extrapolating from a peasant girl spinning wool into the story of Saint Joan of Arc. And you'll see in the background here is an angelic personage. I can't tell from my picture what the angel is holding there. It seems to be holding something. I don't know, maybe Joan's armor. But then again, and much like William Blake, who I mentioned before, he interpolated the angels and angelic presence into everyday life. Now, I don't think he had actual visions. These were completely out of his own spirit, out of his own imagination. But I do think he identified very closely with this idea that an individual man could find that level of spiritual communion. Certainly not in the same way that I imagine the best known Catholic saints felt akin to the angelic presence, the angelic host, Mother Mary. I don't think he believed he was having that experience, but he believed that that sort of spirituality was available to him, and he insisted on recording that experience to communicate it to the rest of us. One more.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Would he have had a model for that kind of painting?
Yeah, that last one was an actual peasant woman spinning, and he extrapolated from that her connection to the spiritual world. So what we're seeing here is that he believed and recorded that in his paintings, that the everyday existence of people who were divorced from modernity, the industrial world, modern inventions and so forth, were closer to the spiritual truth of life as he saw it than others, who weren't living in this sort of primitive, if you want to call it that, existence. This is a picture called The Yellow Christ. This was actually done in 1889, which he was no longer in Breton. He had actually he was actually in Tahiti already by 1889. But this recalls his time in Brittany, because you see the costumes that are consistent with Brittany and the primitive life that he admired. Notice the colorization of the flesh of the Christ figure, the colorization of the trees in the background. It's certainly radical, and in the sense of a continuity between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. We've seen this radical departure from the conventions of representation in favor of an internal view of the world that he's trying to express externally, but which no one else shares, a vision that no one else shares. He's trying to communicate a personal vision of Christ to the viewer of the painting. And notice, this Christ has a goatee like Gauguin I wonder what he's trying to imply there.
He looks a lot like him.
It does look a lot like him. So, I mean, he saw that the hardship that he inflicted on others was part of his saintly mission, except in this case, it's an artistic sainthood, the sacrifice on the altar of art. But there's ego attached to that too, for good or for bad. You know, the idea that there's something so important about expressing one's inner vision that no sort of excess in terms of whom you leave behind is out of the question. I couldn't do it. That doesn't mean he's wrong, but it would just be impossible for me to put my own art against the people that know me, the people that depend on me, and maybe that's why I'm not an icon of post-impressionism as Gauguin was. Certainly, you have to make sacrifices for your art, and I made a few, but I've never abandoned my wife and kids, and nor have I sought a primitive life for its own sake, with the illusion that it was somehow superior to the society of other people. Next, we're going to look at another self-portrait by Gauguin. And where'd that guy go? Hello? Oh, there he is. And there he is with his goatee. This is one of the pictures that he exchanged with Vincent Van Gogh. This is from 1888, right before they shared a house in Arles together. This is when Gauguin was still in Brittany, and he started a correspondence with Van Gogh. And Van Gogh greatly admired Gauguin because Gauguin was the older man. Gauguin had a more conventional university education, and Gauguin had also already sold some paintings. So Van Gogh looked up to Gauguin and was anxious to pursue this friendship. Their correspondences were very mannered, very courtly. They used vous as opposed to tu when they addressed each other in French.
Very formal.
They assumed.
Very formal.
What's that?
Very formal.
Yes, they assumed a formal relationship rather than a familiar relationship, and Vincent was keen to do that. The artist in the upper right-hand corner is someone else who was in on this correspondence, the painter Bernard, Bernard. And then you'll notice he surrounded himself with flowers from nature. I don't think he's trying to represent wallpaper there. I think he's trying to augment the portrait of himself with a touch from nature that it expresses where his interests lie. And also, since they're getting together over the topic of Japanese prints, this is relevant to the expression of nature in Japanese prints. Now, next. Let's go to this picture. This is, that's farther ahead than I really want to go. This is from his, oh wait, here we go. This is a Van Gogh portrait of two little girls. You can see the difference between his representation of the same kinds of themes as Gauguin is illustrating. One difference is the idiosyncrasy of Van Gogh's personal style in the application of paint. I mentioned before in this class that some of the Impressionist artists, Cézanne as a post-impressionist, and most famously, to my mind, Van Gogh, put paint on very thickly, right out of the tube, without diluting it in any way with turpentine or linseed oil or other spirits that are a base for oil paints. He squeezed his paint right out of the tube. And also, Van Gogh, the layout of his paintings, the composition of his paintings was more from the actual sitting, and he was less inclined, as Gauguin was, to refer to what was available to the viewer, but not record it accurately. So Gauguin would rework figures and rework the composition out of his own imagination, which was a critically forward step in the history of art, which is after all the history of one convention following the other. But it anticipates, the rest of 20th century art. Artists like Picasso, who certainly were capable of rendering nature, but weren't interested in doing that. They were interested in presenting their inner life. Now, the same thing is true of Van Gogh, but not in terms of him changing the composition of the picture. So these were likely two girls who sat for Van Gogh in Arles. Let me see if I can get to the actual house where these two lived.
I think he sent it on the initial. But he had the 4 pictures. I think it was the yellow house.
And one more here. Okay. Now, Gauguin arrived in Arles by train. What have I got here? This is an early work by Vincent Van Gogh from 1887. The period where they got together was 1888. Van Gogh lived a primitive life. I don't think he lived it because he thought it was somehow superior to a conventional life. As a matter of fact, one of the things that interests Van Gogh about Gauguin was that Gauguin had been a family man, and Vincent longed for that kind of connection with conventional existence. This is the house that they shared, the yellow house. It's the house on the corner here. It was very close to a cafe, which you can see on the right-hand side, and a grocery store on the left-hand side. And right across the street from this house was the police station that was going to be very important to the last days that they lived together in late December of 1888. They began living together in September. Van Gogh rented a house, the Yellow House as it's known, and let's see if I have a picture of the interior of the house. It's also known as Vincent's room. This is the room on the second floor. Van Gogh rented initially just the bottom floor of the house, which he used as his studio. When he knew that Gauguin was coming, he went on a spending spree to rent out the upper living quarters of the house. So this wasn't actually Vincent's room. This was the room that he set up for his art buddy Gauguin to live in. And Vincent painted this interior from memory later when he was in the asylum after the disastrous end of 1888. I just love this picture. I think it's fantastic. The way it dramatizes such simple objects like the shoe painting we saw before it. There's a character in inanimate objects in a work by Van Gogh, and it's feverishly an independent view. It's feverishly the view of the artist that he's trying to express, the inner life of the artist that he's trying to express, that he imbues the ordinary surrounding with this intensity that was wholly Van Gogh's, that other people don't experience. And so this is known as Vincent's room, but as I say, this is where Gauguin stayed. Vincent was actually staying with friends in Arles for his own quarters, but they shared tempestuously the house together because both men used it as a studio, the downstairs floor, and they were cooped up in the place because it was late fall into early winter that they shared the space together. And a lot of times it was rainy and the weather was quite inclement outside, so they couldn't go into nature together to record what they saw. It's interesting to see the differences between their views of the exterior. This is famous picture again. This is Vincent's chair in that sitting room. He is characterizing the chair. It's very plain, as you can see, a simple straw chair with the back, no armrests, and he's got his tobacco because he associated himself with his tobacco. I can relate to that, and with pipe smoking at this phase of my life. It's an affectation I've adopted. And this is how Vincent has marked this as his chair. Alternately, look at the chair that he set up for his buddy. This is Gauguin's chair, I hope. Are you seeing Gauguin's chair? Oh, there it is.
Mhm.
There we go. Now, he's characterized Gauguin in this chair. For one thing, it's his admiration for the guy as being more cultivated than himself, that he's got a candle and books on this chair. And he was admirable, as I said, of Gauguin's superior education. And the light represents the illumination of knowledge. And it's a more formal chair. It has armrests. It's the comfy chair, as they would say in Monty Python. No, not the comfy chair. And that's the one he gave to his friend. So it's part of Van Gogh's genius that he's able to imbue human qualities to inanimate objects. And this portrait of a chair is essentially a portrait of the man who used it. And it was part of Vincent's generosity that he gave his pal the cushier seating spot. Now this is a This is the cafe right near to the house that they shared. I've always loved this picture too. This is what Van Gogh said about this picture. Notice the red walls. It's not naturalistic. The cafe didn't have red walls. Notice his rendition of the light. It's cartoonish. The lamps have a glow, but they don't look like that. They're not a spiral of individual brush strokes, and yet we know what he's talking about. We know what he's expressing. The bizarre point of view here, bizarre in the sense that it's completely irrelevant to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism to represent depth in this way, but there's no formal perspective. It's done on the flat. It's done more by the distortion of objects, with objects in the foreground being represented as being larger than objects in the background, and that's the means by which the perspective is portrayed. Now, as far as the red walls go, Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo. Absolutely essential to Van Gogh's existence was his relationship with his brother Theo. They were close in age, though it escapes me at the moment which one was older. Theo was an art dealer, and two of Van Gogh's uncles were also art dealers. Theo's gallery was in Paris, and he didn't own the gallery. He operated the gallery for others, and he didn't get to show modern art. He was still showing the art of the Romantics and the neoclassicists of Paris, the conventional art that preceded all of the painters we've talked about, beginning with Pissarro. But he had a gallery where he showed his contemporaries, and the painters who painted more in the style of his brother, Vincent. Theo supported Van Gogh for Van Gogh's entire career. So unlike Gauguin, who abandoned his family and abandoned his connection to his family, Van Gogh relied on those conventions, and he had a very deep relationship with his brother, upon whom he depended his entire life. And when things went afoul in Gauguin and Vincent's roommate situation, Gauguin wrote to Theo at first saying, "I can't stand it anymore. I'm getting out of here." It was because they fought all the time, especially when they were cooped up in the house together. Now, Vincent was a very passionate fellow, as we know, as we might imagine just from those pictures. It was part of his nature that in any argument, like over, who was a better painter, Cézanne or Monet, it was Vincent's bent that he absolutely had to convince you of your point of his point of view. It wasn't enough for him just to argue. He would need to bring you over to his point of view, and it was maddening. He wasn't able to compromise with anyone, and this was making Gauguin, who we know is highly individualistic and even narcissistic, and absolutely wasn't the sort of person who was going to give up his point of view in favor of someone else, no matter how passionately it was argued. I put this up here. Pardon me. This was from the same year, 1888. It's called Haystacks in Provence. I put this up here so that if you can recall the difference between the gauzy flavor and the light in Monet's representation of haystacks to what Vincent is representing here, they're definitely touched by the sun, but that is a brand of yellow that doesn't appear anywhere in nature. I mean, that's from the artist's eternal life. And then again, the heavily applied paint is not characteristic of the Impressionist painters. It's something that comes from Vincent and is part of his own experience, which likely was never experienced by anyone else on this planet. Now, I have to mention here, if you'd like to see a good representation, unlike the romanticized view of Vincent Van Gogh in Lust for Life, as portrayed by Kirk Douglas, check out Robert Altman's film, Vincent and Theo, sometime, where Vincent is portrayed by the actor Tim Roth. They have a theory that art historians have pursued, and I think is somewhat accepted, that part of what was going on with Vincent, he seemed to have a bipolar type of psychological disorder. We can only speculate on that. But it also seems evident that he ate a lot of his paint, okay? And these paints, like cadmium yellow, Vincent's favorite color, they're poisonous. And, you know, rather than wipe the paintbrush off on a cloth, he would absent-mindedly put the paintbrushes in his mouth. Bad Vincent. Don't do that, Vincent. And this may have contributed to his madness. One day, in the house that they shared, Vincent apparently went amok, and the fight that he had with Gauguin reached such a fever pitch that he produced. Gauguin said, "I'm leaving. I can't stay here with you anymore." And Vincent was having a full-blown psychotic break. One thing he did was he wrote all over the walls. He wrote a healthy mind, something akin to a healthy mind and a healthy body. He wrote that on the walls. He also produced a newspaper clipping and waved it in front of Gauguin's face. The newspaper clippings said, "The murderer has escaped." And Gauguin was, to use a colloquial term, freaked out by this, and left to find a hotel room. So disturbed was he by the breakdown that Vincent was having back in the Yellow House. You know, Gauguin was the last person who would take care of someone who was going through a dramatic mental crisis. And so he left the house and went to stay the night in the hotel. Now, while he was out and about that evening, Vincent came apparently into the park. Gauguin heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Van Gogh brandishing a razor at Gauguin. And I don't know if there was an exchange of words, but I know that Gauguin didn't hang out to see what would develop. And then, as the story goes, and has been challenged, but seems nevertheless, from the writings of Gauguin and from descriptions of the event by Van Gogh, seems to be the case. Van Gogh, in his fever, after Gauguin left the house, cut off his ear, left the house, gave the ear to one of the residents of the nearby brothel both men attended, and then stalked Gauguin in the streets, brandishing the razor. It's also been noted that if you cut off your ear, I don't suggest you try this at home. If you cut off your ear, it doesn't bleed immediately. So there wasn't a lot of great loss of blood immediately after he disfigured himself in this way. And then he bandaged himself and evidently returned to his house. Now, the next day, Gauguin went back to the Yellow House, and what he found was policemen and a crowd outside the Yellow House. And he asked what was going on, and Gauguin was arrested for the murder of Van Gogh. They thought he was dead. He was lying on the bed, completely blood everywhere, blood soaking into the bed, and so out of consciousness that they didn't see any signs of life, and they arrested Gauguin as his roommate for the murder of Van Gogh, which harkens back to the newspaper copy that Van Gogh was throwing into his face, almost suggesting, and this is purely speculation, that Van Gogh was punishing Gauguin for leaving by making it seem as if Gauguin had murdered him. Now, I don't think that's in the sense of trying to incriminate Gauguin, but sort of like a lover's quarrel where you say, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. And this is what Van Gogh seems to have attempted to do. I'm looking for, here we go. And then, got that already, okay. Look, sorry, I'm just pulling up our last group of pictures here.
Showed a lot more this time.
Go.
Use it. That's what they teach you in the Zoom classes. We don't need that. Unless you're willing to teach.
All right.
Not.
So we go. So first, I want to show you, this is Van Gogh's self-portrait with the bandaged ear. They found signs of life. They let Gauguin go. Gauguin saw himself as being the victim of an absurd situation, and he referred to himself as a turkey in the situation, which apparently comes from a French idiom. I don't know or recall the entire phrase, but twice in his life, in his journals, he referred to himself as the turkey of this absurd situation. So they released him as the suspected murderer, and Van Gogh was taken to a hospital. There was a doctor who was capable enough that he saved Van Gogh's life. He would have died. He lost a great deal of blood when, as I say, there was a delayed action for the bleeding. And this is a portrait of Van Gogh with his bandaged ear. He was in either a hospital or an asylum for most of the rest of his life. I want to show you another picture because I dare to have an interpretation of this picture that I think is interesting here. Let me see, just a moment. I'm going to show you something.
Did his mental condition worsen subsequent to that? He's taken.
Well, it stayed about the same. This is the doctor who took care of him, Dr. Paul Gachet. This is a portrait of Van Gogh when he was trapped inside the asylum. I wouldn't say trapped. They were taking care of him. There was a reason he was still alive. Gachet had a real affinity for artists and thought that Van Gogh's situation was peculiar to his artistic temperament. But it is nevertheless true that either Van Gogh was suffering from poisoning from his ingestion of elements like cadmium and cobalt in his paints, or he had a psychological condition that we would probably diagnose as bipolar disorder today. Now, bipolar disorder in an extreme form goes back and forth between deep depressions, which Van Gogh experienced, and a heightened mania that can lead to hallucinations. Now, here's a famous picture by Van Gogh, wheat field with crows.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
I believe that he's representing here a seizure akin to like an epileptic seizure, where the crows coming up out of the cornfield as they're doing there. In real time, this would be a horrific experience. This would be quite horrifying. And you see how the sky is becoming blackened with these crows. This is like blacking out. This is like losing consciousness. And Van Gogh rendered this. This is a painting from 1890, which is very close to when Van Gogh died. He died from a self-inflicted gun wound. And you really ought to check out Vincent and Theo by Robert Altman to see how they portray that, the way he shot himself. They show him standing at the canvas, painting. Van Gogh painted a painting a day. This is very unlike the Impressionist artists. Oil paintings can take as long as 7 weeks to fully dry. And Van Gogh did a painting a day, slopping the paint on so that the hand of the artist was visible in every stroke. So in Vincent and Theo, he's portrayed by Tim Roth as standing at the canvas one moment, and then absentmindedly, like he's reaching for the paint, shooting himself in the side. And in a matter of 3 days or so, he died from a self-inflicted gun wound. Now, by 1890, Gauguin had gone to Tahiti, and although we're past our time here, I'm nevertheless going to press on to show you some important work by Gauguin in Tahiti.
First one wasn't good.
What he found when he got to Tahiti was that the primitive life he was seeking, his whole career as an artist, that he hoped he would find in Tahiti, where he would see man in his natural state, existed nowhere in Tahiti by the time he got there. It was a completely colonized French island where traders and government officials of the colony dominated the place. It had a highly parochial culture. There were villages dominated by missionaries, and all of the native people had been converted to Christianity. Even in the outlying areas around the port town of Tahiti, it has a different name that I don't recall. Even outside of the port town, which was like ports all over the world, and frequented by sailors and visitors and cargo ships, there was, out in the outlying areas, they had pots and pans and dry goods that came from modern existence, and nowhere did he find the primitive life that he was seeking. He did take as his wife a 13-year-old girl, because that was the accepted marrying age of girls at the time. This painting is called "When Are You Getting Married?" So he took to wife a young girl and had difficulty communicating with her because he never learned to speak the Tahitian language. And then he actually found that he missed having adult conversation about world affairs, civic affairs, and such. But this was as close as he got to sort of the idyllic Adam and Eve setting that he was seeking. Now, the picture that I showed you in the previous slide, Where Do We Come From? This was the last canvas he painted before Gauguin also attempted to kill himself. And what he did, his health was so run down by starvation and dysentery and syphilis that he decided he'd had enough. So he painted this, which was intended as his spiritual manifesto to the rest of us about his search for identity, his search for a spiritual identity. So he painted this as the last work he was going to produce on this earth. He walked up into the mountains and he swallowed a whole package
Not hearing
of
anymore.
arsenic. What's that? I'm sorry. He swallowed a whole package.
Can't hear anymore, Drew.
I'm sorry?
I can't hear anymore.
Oh,
I can hear.
okay.
Yeah.
My internet
Okay.
connection may be unstable. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
He swallowed a whole package of arsenic, but it didn't kill him. It just made him violently ill. And this picture wasn't his last picture. His subsequent pictures are much more mournful and showed the longing for the primitive life and native subjects who are longing for the primitive life but have lost it in some way, as we see in this picture, which is called Nevermore. And here, the figure, which again is an idealized figure, not made from a model. She's dreaming of a primitive life that is lost, that Gauguin wasn't able to find even in Tahiti. Ironically, you know, I'm not doing justice to all of his paintings. I'm not giving you the moment-by-moment account that exists in his journals of the time. But to reach the end of his career, ironically, he wanted to come home, and he wrote home to a friend that he should like to leave Tahiti and come home now, please. And his friend advised him to stay where he was, that the paintings that he'd been sending home, like the ones I've been showing you previously, were actually starting to sell back in Paris. And part of their attraction was that he was this wild artist who'd found primitive man in his element, his native element, out there in Tahiti. And that if he had come home, it would affect his sales negatively, because he'd become famous for his outlandish attempt to get back to man in his primitive state. And a last picture I'll show you is another one of these pictures that are mournful in their expression. This is called A Day of No Gods, and again represents Gauguin's disillusionment with his search for primitive man. The people are again dreaming of a lost world, of a spirituality that had been destroyed in Gauguin's view by conventions of civilization. And what's here is a longing for the primitive state that no longer exists. This is a completely fanciful idol that you see in the background, comes right out of Gauguin's imagination. Look at his rendering. We've seen how Monet skillfully renders reflections on the surface of the water. Cézanne also had the skill of rendering the very difficult subject of reflections on the surface of the water. You see what Gauguin has done here. We know that we're looking at a stream, but it's not a stream that occurs in nature. And none of the figures in this picture were assembled in one view. All of this comes from the artist's imagination, the artist's personal experience. And to sum up about the post-impressionists, what's true about Gauguin, what's true about Van Gogh, is that they believed very strongly that the artist's personal experience, no matter how feverish and unconventional it was, unlike anyone else's, was an appropriate subject for art. And as we know, there's no more iconic and beloved figure in art than Vincent Van Gogh. So history has proved them right in that regard. So there you go. It's been
Thank
a pleasure working with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank
Definitely.
you for coming
Thank
today.
you. Thank you
Merci
so much.
beaucoup.
Welcome. What's that?
Sorry, it's ending. I
It is ending.
look forward to it.
Well,
Yes, me too.
I'm happy to hear that.
Are you good? No, I learned so much and I just really loved it. So I'm sorry. I didn't realize this was the last class. I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
Is there any possibility that you'll teach like another time, maybe spend like a whole session on each artist?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. Carolyn is evidently in the room right now, and usually when I finish one class, she starts pestering me to invent the.
Oh, Carolyn, please! Carolyn, please! It's Chris Grad. I would love another class.
Yeah, it's Penny Berman. I would too.
Thanks so much.
Ditto.
Howard Rosenblatt. I
It would be
agree.
nice if someday we could meet in person and have coffee.
That would be wonderful.
idea.
Yeah.
I would enjoy that a great deal. Hopefully that'll happen within the next 15 months or so.
Well, God willing, and the creek don't rise.
Exactly. All right.
Right.
So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
appreciate your
very much.
positive feedback more than you'll know. And again, it's been my pleasure to present this course to you, and I do hope to see all of you again. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stay
Drew.
well.
Thank
Stay
you.
well.
Okay.
and safe.
All right. If you'd like a link to this last show, you can write me. I put my email up on the in the chat corner of your screen.
Can you just send it to all of us?
I'd be happy to do that. I'll send you all the links
Yeah, that would
to recordings of this class, so you can have access to those.
Oh, I would
I'll
love
send that
that.
out to you automatically.
Thank you.
All
right,
Thank you
then.
very much.
Great.
Thanks so much, Joe.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Drew.
you all again.
Stay home
you.
now.
Email.
Okay, bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.